Hey, hello. As you can probably tell by the return of this blank white wall, except of course for the spot where I bumped a table into it, 2 years ago at this point, I don't know. We have reached the part of the year where I do not want to turn my window unit off, and so I have moved to another room. So ideally, in a perfect world, I would have come up with a better solution than this blank white wall, but we do not live in an ideally perfect world, I guess, because I have not come up with a better solution. However, I do have a much better camera than last year, so I'm hoping that that will help a little bit as well. I don't know, I'm probably overthinking it, in addition to the fact that my skin tone is very close to this white wall, so as long as we can tell a difference between the two, we're good. But if you are here, you know that we are going to go over May books read. Obviously, we are toward the tail end of June at this point, and so I am behind. However, I did put up a community post asking if people were even still interested, because you might not be, and we did get more people say they were interested than not. So I would apologize to the people who voted not, but they are surely not here. And if you are here and voted not, hey, thanks. I appreciate you being here despite not really caring. So we are going to go through these, and it may be a little faster ideally because it's been a second since I read these, but I do want to talk about them, especially the ones we didn't talk about on Feature Fridays, so you can get kind of a sense of the books. However, I do think that I've been getting kind of this weird like foggy brain, and I don't know if it's like a slump or what it is, where I don't feel like I'm articulate about some things enough. So we'll see how much I recall about some of these, and it's easy, I think, for me to feel guilty about not remembering every detail of some of these books, but at the same time, when I don't, it is just what it is, and that might say something about the book, even though some of them I really did enjoy, but I think that that is a deeper kind of conversation and exploration than we need to have here. But we started out the month really, really strong because we started out May, believe it or not, remember when we read Divine Rivals by Rebecca Ross. I say we, but I read it, but we didn't talk about it. And I really, really loved this. I have been behind on getting to A Fire Endless, which is the sequel to A River Enchanted, which I read last year, was one of my top books of the year, loved it. However, it was a HarperCollins title, so the sequel came out during the strike and I just didn't get back to it, or haven't gotten back to it, and prioritized Divine Rivals based on the fact that it was a new release, a 2023 release, and purely just on the fact that it was going to be due back at the library and that people were on the wait list for it. So it wasn't like I could renew it or I could get it back in my hands easily in theory. And this is much different than what I typically gravitate toward, because it is very World War I coded in its magical system. It still is taking place in a fantasy world of sorts, but it is very much designed to feel like World War I era Britain to me as a reader. So it involves two like junior reporters who have a kind of rivalry going on because this is young adult, and they are basically competing for the same open position. And they come from very different backgrounds. Iris, one of our leads, has had to quit school despite a promise to her brother as he was going away to the front to fight, because her mother has been kind of consumed by grief after her brother left, and she needs to help support the family, and this journalism job is that for her. Roman, on the other hand, comes from wealth and privilege and seems like a kind of stereotypical wealthy young gentleman at the outset of this book, in the way that he both kind of talks to Iris, some of the things Iris has overheard, but there is additional depth there that we as readers get to know about, and we learn that our protagonists have been talking without realizing it through these kind of magical letters. And these letters originate through Iris writing letters to her brother and putting them away in this cupboard. So we do have a little bit of that kind of magical, like Narnia feel to things because of the use of the wardrobe as a kind of portal, even though it doesn't end up being the wardrobe that holds the magic. And so we get to kind of go with these characters. The book really is kind of broken up into thirds. We don't spend forever at this newspaper. Our leads end up traveling to the front for various reasons and become war correspondents. And the war is a magical war with like gods, though we don't get a full peek at the gods in this book. We get kind of some of their backstory. We see Iris kind of learning the story. We see Roman giving Iris pieces of the story because Roman may have a little bit more information about who he is talking to than Iris does for a portion of the book and what that means as well. And it of course does have this strong romantic subplot. So it definitely has this kind of rivals to lovers energy, which, as I mentioned before in the feature Friday for this, I really gravitate toward. That rivals to lovers, enemies to lovers, very similar things, but the idea that there is this competition and this competitive spirit that kind of brings out the best in the other, and the idea that you are meeting this other person, even if you don't always get along, there is always this underlying respect for the other person's competence, and the idea that you really see a match in this person in whatever way. And amidst all of this, it has that really lyrical style that I really responded to in A River Enchanted from Ross, but is tailored to this new setting, and I think really fits. I think that they're, like I said, it's something just kind of lyrical, musical in a way, and there are bits of music here, or a kind of root in music similar to how there is in River Enchanted, similar in that they exist for both but aren't being utilized in the same way, I should note. And I go into this, of course, in more depth in the feature Friday, but I would like to reiterate as well the fact that both this book, Divine Rivals, and A River Enchanted from Rebecca Ross really helps solidify my instinct. Even if I don't necessarily like the first book I've read from an author, I will give them another shot if I am intrigued by the blurb, if I think it sounds interesting, because I do often have this experience like I had with this. When I read my first from Rebecca Ross, I didn't like it. And this was a while ago now, 2016, 2017. I don't know. I could look it up, but we're not going to do that. But instead with The River Enchanted, when I looked up the author, saw I hadn't enjoyed the first book, I gave it a shot instead of saying, oh, this author doesn't write to my tastes. And what would I have missed if I hadn't given it a shot? And I also think it really illustrates, sorry if this is a soapbox, the importance of authors being cultivated in their writing and in their careers, because a first book is a first book. And I think the system puts so much pressure on debuting and being a hit right out of the gate, especially now where you almost have to have a kind of system in place to help you really break through the noise in a way that is really stressful, I'm sure, for a lot of authors. And so there is all of this pressure on hitting it out of the park with your first book, which, keep in mind, is a lot of marketing as well, instead of helping cultivate these authors. And when you think, or when I think of a lot of the authors I really enjoy, like someone like V.E. Schwab, which I didn't start reading until A Darker Shade of Magic, or Courtney Summers, who I didn't start reading until All the Rage. And I think both of those books are kind of positioned in discourse as breakout hits, and it's so easy to forget the books that came before that that helped kind of pave the way for those books, and the way that those books may not have been massive breakout hits, but how these authors were allowed to kind of experiment and learn their craft. I don't know, as usual, that may be a larger conversation for another day, but I think it's important to keep in mind. So if you are interested in this and maybe didn't like something early on from Ross, I had a similar experience. However, if you didn't like A River Enchanted and are interested in this, they do, to me, both read very similarly in the emotions they evoke, which I think is why I respond well to both of them, so that may be a different consideration. And then moving on from Divine Rivals, which I just talked about for a hot second, despite telling you we were going to try and move quicker through this, I read Lone Women by Victor Lavelle. This was my first Victor Lavelle, despite having heard great things about his writing for years, and I need to go back and get into that backlist because this really knocked it out of the park for me. It is definitely one of my top books of the year so far. I think Divine Rivals too. Maybe we'll have a longer conversation about that another time as well. But it is very atmospheric. It does that thing where it makes me like something I didn't think I liked, in this case, Westerns. However, it also has that bit of horror and supernatural to it. We are using supernatural horror-based manifestations as a metaphor here in many ways. I mean, not in many ways. It's a metaphor. I just am not really going to unpack the metaphor in this moment, but we'll let you do that for yourself. But we have our protagonist Adelaide, who is moving cross country from California to Montana because she has kind of been drawn in by the railroad newspaper articles kind of praising Montana as a state and its climate in particular, and gets there and realizes she's been sold a load of baloney. But she is also trying to escape, and we have this very vivid visual image from the outset of her dragging this trunk and what is in the trunk. We know it's a secret, a shame of some kind, but what is it? And so in many ways, the kind of isolation of Montana should work to her benefit. It will help her escape and kind of fall off the map as she is looking to do. But instead, we see her trying to grasp to any community she can find. And we explore the real kind of dangers and simmering resentments of small communities in particular, and the way that, you know, everything can be kind of shiny and smiley on the outset, but what is lurking underneath. And we get this from the very opening bit where she arrives in Montana, where we are in the head of a newspaper man who goes to the train every day to greet the new arrivals and to get their stories. And so we see him waiting and excited to grasp any new information. This idea that someone new coming into the community would be huge news. It almost gave me kind of like a Wells Fargo wagon from the Music Man kind of feeling. But when Adelaide arrives, he ignores her and walks right past her because she is a Black woman. And so what does it mean for her to be in this community? And what does it mean with her history? And so it's really interrogating a lot. It's a thin little book. It packs a punch. There were times that I thought maybe some of it could have been explored even more, but I think ultimately Lavelle knows what he's doing, especially in the economy of language, because especially when it's something like horror, you have that tension that you're fighting against, and maintaining that tension is so delicate and so hard to do. And I think the tension here is so masterfully executed, especially because from the outset we are talking about this trunk. And so the secret of the trunk is what I thought was going to be kind of sitting in the corner for us as readers over the course of the novel. I thought that was going to be the big reveal, but it is revealed like maybe halfway, I forget exactly how far through the book, what is in that trunk, what is going on. And so it's really kind of grappling with more than just that secret, but the fallout of it and the whole picture of things and the whole picture of community and how community forms, and also this idea of lone women and how women can band together in different ways, and what it means to be alone, what it means to find a community, and what communities are, but also the dangers of those communities. And I think that it really plays with the idea of the Western, like I mentioned in my Feature Friday, in a way that I find interesting, because what I usually don't respond too well to with Westerns, and granted I haven't read a whole lot of them, but you're probably not going to catch me reading a Louis L'Amour, let's put it that way. I don't really care about man versus nature in the way that it's often presented in this kind of individualistic, kind of man taking control of nature in whatever way kind of narrative. This real kind of mythologizing of the one kind of succeeding out in the vast wilderness, or like the kind of lawlessness of the Wild West kind of narrative. That isn't something I've been necessarily inherently interested in. Where I am interested in the lawlessness side of things, especially in this book, is that kind of breakdown of community when the sense of law is so different, but also this idea of how different is it really? And in some ways it's then asking us, how different are our communities right now? What have we mythologized? And it really unpacks a lot. And I think that this is where I'm interested in exploring kind of Westerns, especially if there is a supernatural element, obviously. So I guess if you have more recommendations in this vein, in that kind of constant, the moment I say I don't like something is when I will find something in that vein that I do respond to. And then as I'm switching positions here so my leg doesn't go to sleep, I read A Week to be Wicked by Tessa Dare, which is the second in the Spindle Cove series, which, as I mentioned before, is a series that I saw recommended a lot back when Bridgerton season 1 first premiered in series to read if you enjoyed Bridgerton, or maybe more accurately, series that romance readers would also like to see translated to the screen a la Bridgerton. So we of course had the Wallflowers series by Lisa Kleypas, which I read back 2 years ago now, and now I'm finally going back to the Spindle Cove series by Tessa Dare. I of course have read other Tessa Dare, and this is kind of filling that void while I am waiting for the new Tessa Dare, and I hope everything is okay with Tessa Dare there, because it has been a longer wait than usual for that book with her. So I'm just wishing her the best, whatever is going on there. But this book is following Minerva and Colin from the first book obviously, or not obviously, but it is our kind of wallflower and rakish trope book, which I love. Additionally, if you hear Colin and are like, oh, I am eagerly anticipating another Colin story soon too, if you are in need of something to kind of fill the void before Bridgerton season 3, I think this would fit the bill as well. It's not beat for beat or point for point by any means, but we do have Minerva, who is a geologist and a wallflower in many ways, and she is not taken seriously by her mother in ways that mirror to me a lot Romancing Mr. Bridgerton, and particularly that parlor scene. If you've read Romancing Mr. Bridgerton, you know what I'm talking about. If you haven't, don't worry, we will be revisiting that book before Bridgerton season 3 comes out. And the start of this book also reminds me of another beloved romance, Devil in Winter by Lisa Kleypas, part of the Wallflower series, because it opens with our heroine basically coming to our rakish hero in the middle of the night with a proposition. And in this case, Minerva wants Colin to stay away from her sister, who he has been seen to be kind of courting around town, and her mother has it in her head that they will end up together, but Minerva does not see that as in her sister's best interests. So she basically tries to bribe him by asking him to fake an engagement with her, and she has this idea to get this prize money for this geology competition that she foresees herself winning. She has been communicating with other members of the society through letters, through a name that doesn't necessarily identify her as a woman at the outset, and so as a reader, you know, you can anticipate further dramatic action coming of that. And they end up on this adventure to this conference because Colin is going to tell Minerva no deal, but he goes to meet her in the morning to tell her that, and she has already basically left a letter at home saying what is going on. So her reputation is on the line no matter what. So he initially goes with her on this travel to try and figure out how to resolve the situation. And there is, of course, bickering. He never calls her by her real name. Of course, if you've read the first Spindle Cove book, you know that Colin is a bit of a womanizer, but also that he has something tragic in his past that haunts him at night, and so he can't sleep without female company. And so this complicates things when he's on the road with just Minerva. And so you've got a lot of your typical kind of rake and wallflower moments of kind of seeing each other vulnerable for the first time and being able to strip away some of those personas. Additionally, for another Bridgerton kind of tie-in reference. But of course, these are just, you know, common things and devices and plot points that can happen, especially in historicals. So it's more just if you enjoyed it, but the kind of dramatic tension with the carriage at the end of Anthony and Kate's story, especially in the book, we kind of see in a different way here as well. So there are a lot of elements that I really like that are thrown in here and really are a lot of fun. There were parts where I just kept waiting for it to go that extra mile in some way, and so I feel like it's starting to slip away from me a little bit in a way that makes me a little sad. I don't know how long it will stick with me, but I still enjoyed the ride. So don't take that as an indictment by any means, because I really did enjoy it. I do think part of that might just be that the way that romance has progressed so much in the last decade especially is that this does feel like a more old school historical in a lot of ways. It still has a lot of that banter that we get with this kind of dynamic and setup, obviously, but it doesn't have quite the same bite that if she wrote this today that it might have. I'm not saying it's better or worse without that kind of modern bite, because I think there is still some of that at play, but I think that the way that's being written now is just a little bit different. So not good or bad based on that, just something that I noticed. And then keeping in line with historical romance, because obviously that's what I was in the mood for, I read Anna Maria and the Fox by Liana de la Rosa. Now this was an interesting read to me because there was a lot of it that I really enjoyed, especially like I talked about in my Feature Friday for this book, some of the early setup for Anna Maria, especially like as she's introduced at one of the first balls she goes to. I like the idea of the dynamics with her sisters, and I really enjoy the potential between the relationship between Anna Maria and Gideon Fox, especially because both of them have such real pressing and tangible political concerns that really shape their relationships with each other and really make the stakes feel present, or we understand why they are pulling back at certain points potentially. However, I unfortunately think that the pacing, and not even the pacing maybe, but the structure of this book is somewhat off, and a lot of that, no, I think it is pacing. And I talked about this before in the Feature Friday, and some of it also may just be expectations that were set based on the blurb. There was some copy on the blurb that intimated a marriage of convenience, and when you imply that trope to me as a reader, I'm anticipating much different dynamics, or for that to play into the dynamics a lot, and in this book, it doesn't come into play until 3/4 of the way through at least. And so there is a lot of kind of like wheel spinning in the early bits, and yet I don't know that we really get to know the depth of some of the characters as much as I would have liked, having all of that space and room to do that work. So I think that the instincts were really good. We see in like especially the ballroom scenes, the building out of like these subtexts behind like these battles going on verbally in these rooms, things of that nature, and we can feel that restraint to everything, but it doesn't feel completely natural then when that restraint is let loose, because we haven't built things necessarily organically to me as a reader. And I think, like I said, a lot of that was pacing, and I think it was editorial, to be completely honest. I think that if we had just kind of worked with what we had and shaped it and morphed it just a little bit more intentionally, that we could have gotten to those emotional kind of climaxes in a more natural manner, because the characters were built in a way that all of that made sense. It just didn't make sense completely in the way it was executed. And so I'm anxious to see how this series continues, because I did really like what was established here, and I have a suspicion that I'm going to enjoy the sisters books even more, which does make me sad as well, because I think that Anna Maria had so much to her as a character, but it's so much that was so understated. And I think that there was effort put into communicating that, this idea that she had been built up to be this perfect politician's daughter and she knows how to play the game, but we didn't really get to see her grapple with that as a character as much as maybe I would have liked, and so her sisters ended up upstaging her sometimes. So I don't know. I'm still excited about the rest of this series, but think that there was some undeveloped potential here that I would have liked to see pushed just a little bit further, but I of course talk about all of that in more depth in the Feature Friday. And then moving on, I read Couplets by Maggie Milner. This is a book of poetry. I don't know how much I really have to say about this, because as mentioned before, I'm still working on building up my vocabulary and language around talking about poetry in a more critical sense, and critical in the sense of discussion. But I felt like these poems had a good weight to them. They were exploring relationships and love and intimacy and sexuality in a really raw way, and they were just kind of mirroring that time of life, whenever it may come for you, where you are kind of experimenting and figuring yourself out and what you want from yourself in a relationship, what you want from your partners, what you want your relationship to look like, what you want emotionally, physically, whatever. And I think that there was a real honesty there and a real vulnerability in how it was presented. And I felt like the poems really let us sit in that journey with the author. So yeah, wish I had something a little bit more profound to say about the collection, but really enjoyed it and was really compelled by it. Would not be surprised to see it show up in end of the year lists, particularly for like the Goodreads Choice Awards for poetry. So I guess we'll see. And then I listened to Quietly Hostile by Samantha Irby, which is her newest collection of essays, and she hit it out of the park as usual. There was a part, I can't remember where she mentioned something specifically to Chicago, and she was basically like, I just threw that in so my Chicago people would be like, I know what you're talking about, and got it in one, because I definitely mentally at that point of the book was like, I know what you're talking about. It was probably something like Merchandise Mart. I don't know, but Irby's essays are always so fun and kind of irreverent, but insightful at the same time. And it's like just talking to a good friend at a bar, and like the friend that is gonna make you shoot drinks out of your nose from laughing. And it just feels like such a just fun conversation, especially listening to it on audiobook. And honestly, that is really how I would recommend doing these books. And especially if you're trying to find a way to fit audiobooks into your reading, I started out and basically returned to comedy essays, especially comedic essays like these, when I need to find my way back to audiobooks, and they're just a lot of fun. Now, there are also parts that are extremely personal, or like the kind of like embarrassing or raunchy story you would usually only tell to your best friends, but like told in the style of you telling it to your best friends, except Irby is way funnier than I will ever be in my life. It really made me think too, because I have been known to kind of consider like potty humor as like a lower form of humor, or like a younger form of humor, but there were times that she was talking in this collection about things that would be probably considered potty humor, and even in past collections, and I was cracking up because they mirror experiences, especially as you're aging, that we often don't talk about. I think it was in her last collection, but she had a whole like segment about like dressing to go out, and I think she was specifically talking about like going out to Boys Town at the time, and just like how you have to think about going to the bathroom. And so she is just honest and funny and a great time if you're just looking for a great time, but I think would really be a great choice for like summertime audiobooking, whether you're just like taking your dog on a walk, working in the garden, hanging out at the beach, whatever you're up to. I think it would just be a delight, even if you listen to it like I do or did, in that I was making more mundane, regular chores more fun, which I succeeded in by listening to this book. So something to keep on your radar if you're looking for fun essay collections. And then I read another book we have talked about for Feature Friday, and the only book I still have physically in my possession that I read last month, Homebuddies by Tembi Denton-Hurst. This was a much different novel than I was expecting, as we discussed in my Feature Friday, and so I am trying and have tried to talk about it in relation to what it is as a novel instead of what I was expecting, because that's not fair to it as a book for me to be talking about kind of what I was expecting from it, because I was expecting almost a kind of searing indictment of like media culture, particularly from the point of view of a Black gay woman. However, it is that to a certain extent, but it's much more of a kind of like deep character study, slow burn novel than I expected, because we spend most of the book back home with our protagonist Mickey after she has fled the city after losing her job at this magazine. Her relationship, her long-term relationship, is starting to kind of crumble a little bit, in the sense that they're facing some major challenges, particularly around how her girlfriend talks about her to her family, but also just how that they interact in the relationship and how Mickey losing her job has impacted their relationship, and just a lot of the stressors that you go through as a couple during those big moments, but also when you've been a couple for a long time. And what I do appreciate about this book is it is a look at a long-term lesbian couple and kind of the challenges that they are facing in their relationship, having been together for a longer time. And I feel like as a reader, and this is completely on me as well, I haven't read as many books that are particularly exploring the challenges of long-term relationships from the lesbian perspective. So I found that extremely beneficial as well. Even as our protagonist was making a lot of choices that had me like beating my head against the wall at times, but it was that kind of real in-depth character study of a character that is making some messier choices at times, but is that exploration. So I think I'm going to point back to my Feature Friday for some more articulate, defined thoughts on this one, though I'm sure, as always, they could be more articulate and defined, but they'll at least be more articulate and defined than they are here. And then I listened to The Once and Future Sex, Going Medieval on Women's Roles in Society by Eleanor Janega. This was what it sounds like, an exploration of how women were conceptualized of in medieval society. And so I think it kind of touches on the more obvious things that I think that we know a little bit more culturally, like the way that women's bodies were idealized differently in the medieval age than they are today, but then also touched on different things, like just how women's characters were defined differently then than they are now, and particularly how a lot of this was shaped by the church. But I also appreciated how it looked at class in all of this as well, because when it's talking about like the idealized woman in medieval society, like today in many ways, that ideal is really only actualized when you have the status and the wealth to be able to achieve it. For instance, as is often talked about, pale skin being seen as an indicator of class because you don't have to go outside and work. Soft hands being an indicator of a life of leisure in whatever way, but all of the different levels of that. So it felt like a primer in a lot of ways, but it was great to have all of that information kind of centralized in one place. I liked how readable it was, or how easy of a listen it was, I should say, while it also like was very clear that we were pulling on sources to kind of explore these different expectations, ideals, what have you. So it was an interesting listen. I did download it on Libro.fm so I can revisit it in the future as well. Of course, because it is a medieval history study, it is a very Eurocentric kind of examination of things. So I would be interested to find similar books that are exploring kind of similar ideals and ideas across the globe in the same time period, but it was very interesting interesting, and I'm interested in how it is in conversation with our own time period as well. And I do think it did a great job at kind of showing things in contrast to how they are now, so that could be part of the dialogue, but then also kind of helping us trace where certain ideals from that time have bled into modern ideals and conversations. So interesting ideas for sure. I need to revisit to really be able to unpack the full breadth of it, I think. But wait, because I skipped a whole book before that, actually I read Queen Charlotte by Julia Quinn, which we have also talked about in depth. So if you haven't seen it, I would also direct you to the video talking about the book in relation particularly to the show. So I think one of the things that surprised me most about the book was that it had 4 points of view. I think one of the things I was most interested in was how we were going to conceptualize of what we saw in the television show translated to a more traditional romance novel if we were getting it penned by Julia Quinn. Even in tandem with Shonda Rhimes, there is that expectation of it fitting the mold of a more traditional romance novel in some ways because of that. And I think the end was maneuvered very well, especially in terms of giving it that epilogue feel, rooting us in the emotions of those moments in the show because they hit so hard, and that ending scene and the way that that ending scene was shot is still so fantastic. And I think that it captured the sense of that without being able to visually communicate that in the same way. And I think that the way that we are kind of fitting this into a more traditional romance novel really ties into these additional points of view as well. As we were given points of view for Charlotte and George, but also Lady Danbury and Brimsley. And we, I think as viewers, I as a viewer was very interested in both the story of Brimsley and Lady Danbury. We cut back on a lot of Lady Danbury's story in relation to what we got from the show because the book was really only focusing on George and Charlotte. So we did not get the modern storylines that we got in the show, except for the prologue where we were kind of setting up this flashback to young Charlotte. And so we didn't have that same dynamic between Violet and Lady Danbury that was playing out. And so a lot of Lady Danbury's storylines were left out unless they kind of coincided with Charlotte's storylines and were moving Charlotte forward. And so I understood it from a structural point of view, but I was just very interested in that choice because I think a lot of readers are very interested in more from Lady Danbury. So I would be very interested to know if they have more planned for that in the future. I don't know. Additionally, I think one of the main things that a lot of viewers were interested in after the show was related to what happened with Brimsley and Reynolds. And we did get a lot more insight, I would say, into their relationship from Brimsley's point of view. Now, his story was still really being filtered through Charlotte's story. So we got a lot more in relation to that, but because Brimsley and Reynolds are so connected to the king and queen, it made it a little bit easier for that story to be forwarded in tandem. We did not, however, get any answers to the actor because we weren't really focusing, like I said, on those modern storylines. So that is still the big question kind of out in the ether, and I think purposefully, because I think they want to leave that open for more dramatic action potentially in the future, but it also keeps fans engaged and in conversation, and ultimately not every story needs to be tied up in a neat little bow, and sometimes the best storytelling isn't, because at the end of the day, we still know some of the end there. We know that Brimsley chose Charlotte in whatever way, whether it was his active choice, whether it was chosen for him. We know he's still with Charlotte. We know what he has sacrificed in some ways to be with Charlotte and to serve Charlotte. So it's an interesting kind of dynamic. The book, I don't think overshadowed the show for me in any way. And while I did admire its maneuvering, I would have liked to see it take some more risks as a book. I think that it turned the show into a novel pretty successfully, but it didn't necessarily offer anything new. And I don't know that it really took its own ownership of the source material in terms of helping us deepen Charlotte and George and giving us as readers maybe a perspective or point of view that we wouldn't get in the show because we're not in their heads in the same way. And we definitely got some of that. I don't want to imply we didn't, but it felt somewhat safe to me on some level. And again, that's all my own interpretation, but I would have liked to see that go maybe a step further. But also, as I've said before, we usually see books translated to the screen, so it's very interesting to see it in the reverse. Not that it never happens, but that we see it less often. And I dive into all of that a lot more in that Queen Charlotte video, so I'm not going to keep you here rehashing the same things. But if you're interested in that and haven't seen that video yet, feel free to pop on over. And then finally, last of the month, I reread Spoiler Alert by Olivia Dade for my romance book club. This is my second time reading this book. I did it on audio this time. It was as delightful as the first time. I had forgotten how fast-paced it was, how quickly the relationship in this really does move, but I really like the exploration of characters. Oddly enough, the kind of secrets that were being held in the book from Marcus didn't bother me as much this time around. I think the first time I really struggled with it, and I still had an amazing time, but I think in my original review I was like, oh, I struggled with this a little bit, but I'm rating up because I had such a fantastic time. And this time around, I understood like how those kind of secrets compounded and why he would be afraid to speak up in the way that he was in the book, so it didn't bother me as much. And it was just very interesting to kind of track my progression as a reader with that within like 3 years. So yeah, I still need to read the third one in this series. I love the second one as much or maybe more than the first book. I pre-ordered the third one. It was just another kind of casualty of the HarperCollins strike, and I didn't want to read it and not be able to talk about it. So I need to swing back and read it so I can talk about it because I'm very excited for that book as well. So that was May. I apologize that it took me so long to talk about it with you, and am grateful that any of you were still interested at all. So if you read any of these books, I would of course be interested to hear your thoughts, and am ever grateful that you are at all interested in mine. In that same vein, as I've been saying for a second now, we are inching closer and closer to 1,000, and so any engagement you want to throw my way, like, comment. If you haven't subscribed would be greatly appreciated, because it didn't seem real or possible when I first started out here, but now that it's like within arm's reach, I'm like, I kind of want it. But above all else, I am so grateful that you are at all interested in being here and giving me a space to talk about books, nerd out about books, and just explore my reading life and the world of books with you. So thank you for being here. Thank you for listening to what I have to say. Read something good. And yeah,